Today we're looking at the last lecture in the winter 1931 term of Jung's Vision Seminars. There's one main vision that we're going to talk through today. Remember that last time Christiana emerged from the unconscious, the cave that she followed the goat down into. There she encountered several snakes, two of which represented sort of the impasse of her consciousness that were debating semantics, and the third was sort of the unavoidable third term, which was subjectivity itself. The black snake, which brings with it the poison of subjective consciousness. Once she incorporated the black snake, she was compelled to exit the cave, upon which she threw up the black snake onto a golden disc, where it burned to ashes, almost like a phoenix. The notion here is that if one is willing to endure the subjective process, to accept the way things appear to them, and to offer the depths of their psyche to the outer world, there is the possibility that the world needs just what you're offering, and that it can occasion transformation. So upon this sacrifice of subjectivity, which was not a sacrifice to objectivity or the collective, but was just the sacrifice of subjectivity itself, Christiana was then led to a dark wall, a large wall with an eye on it. This is a critical juncture in the vision, representing her encounter with the ecstatic God in its fullness, in its purity. As the Holy Spirit, we might think that her encounter with this ecstatic God and the God Pan in the initial series of lectures represented her identification with the Christ, or the Son of God, who was ecstatic, but also unified in its single person. Through the encounter with the God as the I, Christiana is left feeling that she is sort of a smallness in front of God, wholly other from it. There's no unifying personality other than subjectivity itself, which remains as sort of an inferential transcendental term. So she comes upon this black eye, and there's a series of visions that are in this lecture that I'm not going to consider, that have to do with what Jung suggests is her being in the interior of the eye. The notion here is essentially that she enters the unconscious through the eye, and is immersed in sort of the eye's liquids. She has a bunch of visions about being under the sea, and the idea, I think, is that when the eye of God is staring at you, you become small, you retreat, you withdraw, you are totally terrified and afraid, and that forces you to look deep within the recesses of your unconscious, and that's sort of what happened to Christiana. There is an interesting aside, too. Another part of the vision may be a consequence of sort of encountering this eye with possibly some moral overtones here, but there is a rather protracted discussion between Jung and the seminar participants about sacrificial prostitution. So Christiana encounters a couple of images that lead Jung to make this interpretation. She's sort of led by this madam to a kind of back room with men in it. Jung suggests if you want to be initiated, this is his interpretation of her entering this sort of back room with red lipstick on. If you want to be initiated, he says, you must be offered to the men. You will be a sort of temple prostitute. So I think there's really interesting is it doesn't really necessarily do this justice here. It's not clear to me that this is interesting. I think Christiana seems to, if you let these visions speak of them for themselves, what seems to be happening is Christiana sees within herself this tendency to become the prostitute for men. And this has been a kind of a criticism of the vision seminars in general, is that in giving her visions to Jung, she's sort of selling her soul or something like that to this man in power, and allowing him to sort of manipulate. And I mean, to some extent, the sort of psychotherapy is a bit creepy, to the extent that you are confessing, and it's more than a confession was in old times, where you would tell a priest, I did these things, and then he would say, you are forgiven. There is a deep sense in which the therapist gets involved in the individual. Steiner talks about it as a sort of overdoing of the karmic ties. He thinks that anthroposophy, for example, is superior to psychoanalytic work because it doesn't you don't develop karmic ties to the therapist or the client. And so there's this really interesting way, and again, interesting isn't exactly the right word here, where Jung is sort of encouraging her to be the prostitute in her unconscious. And it's sort of necessary to the extent that now that she's encountered the inner prostitute, as it were, she can work that out. And Jung does kind of see the other side of this when he starts to talk about anima and animus possession, that is, obsession with somebody of the opposite sex. There is an extent to which you can't simply relinquish that. You have to accept the projection. The individual with whom you are obsessed carries something that is an outward signification of something that is inside of you, but you're so drawn to it outside that you can't quite access it yet inside, and the obsession is compelling you to look inside. And so it's an interesting dynamic where Christiana becomes the prostitute in order to find her inner prostitute. It's very strange. And Jung suggests that for the time being, our patient simply has to accept a certain kind of relationship to a man who represents the individuated man. Of course, here it seems to me that he's referring to himself. And what's happening in the context of this therapy is Christiana sees Jung as an individuated man. He's 55. She's not even 35 yet. She's sort of attracted to him in some way. He contains something that she wants, although she doesn't want to be seen with him. There's a part of the vision that we won't get to where she's essentially removed from the vision where the man and the woman are. The idea seems to be that this is Jung's interpretation, is she has an attraction to Jung. She wants to be a prostitute for him. And he's allowing this to happen because she has to do that projection in order to get to the other side of it. And so there's, of course, very controversial themes, feminist themes, general themes of the allowance of so-called evil in the context of the therapeutic relationship that we'll have to probably leave there for now. Okay. So let's get to the final vision. The final vision of the term, it's two visions that have kind of compressed into one. I'll read it and then I'm going to go. There's a fair bit of interpretation here. We won't get to all the interpretation. The second part of the interpretation of this vision spills into the next term, which I'll try to get to. The idea here, though, is that the two primary visions of the first two lectures, the dual God Pan on the one hand and the experience of the ecstatic eye of God on the other, represent two profound aspects of initiation, where the third term is beginning to be realized as some sort of natural transcendent bridge between the dual animal and the holy other God. Of course, this is the Son of God and Father. Interestingly, Jung talks about what a disaster it is to call the eye of God Father. And I think that's probably right. He talks about it in the Mana personality in 2 Essays on Analytical Psychology. But I'll save that also for another day. So here's the vision. I stood before the black wall. I said to the eye, this is Christiana, how shall I surmount the wall? The eye turned inward on itself. I also turned my eye inward, and within myself I saw a growing tree. This is the third term, right? So there's a couple things happening. Then I looked outward again at the wall, and I beheld a tree growing near it. I walked over the tree. It gathered me up in its branches, and it lifted me over the wall. On the other side, I beheld a man. I looked into his eyes and saw therein a great river. Okay, so let's bring this all together. The first two terms we can bring together now. She starts with the animal god Pan, who is both suffering and joy in one. She recognizes that as the sort of primary, most fundamental, ultimate expression of the human condition. I turned my eye inward, and within myself I saw a growing tree. She's asking this, how do I surmount the wall, she asks. So once she realizes the dual nature of humanity, she goes into her unconscious and finds the shadow. She accepts the shadow and offers it as a sacrifice, upon which she's greeted by the eye of God, who is the second. He's really the first person of the Trinity. The second person she encountered as the suffering and joy. By accepting suffering and joy, she accepted her shadow. By accepting her shadow, she sacrificed her shadow. By sacrificing her shadow, it's revealed to her to whom she sacrificed the shadow. And the answer is the omnipotent, omnipotent eye of God is to whom the shadow was sacrificed. And then what happened? She sacrifices the shadow. The eye of God is revealed. She descends into her unconscious. She encounters her sort of evil, wicked ways of prostitution, right? This is what, the better way to think about it is there are these earlier modes of adaptation that the revelation of the eye of God shows her, brings her into her consciousness so that they can be transformed. So with the eye of God, she looks within herself. And this is the part we're going to have to leave for the next series of lectures is she looked inward and she saw a tree growing within herself. And then she looked outward and there was a tree growing outside of herself. So this is the notion we talked a bit about last time that I'm starting to call Sindhya, which is co-division. The notion that what one does within oneself is mirrored in what happens to one outside. Scientifically, you might say something like the perception or apperception of aspects of oneself allows one to then see new things in the world they wouldn't have seen had they not perceived themselves in a certain way. That may be one way to think about it. The other way, the synchronistic way to think about it is these two things are happening independently of one another, and whatever that relationship might be. It seems to me actually a quite interesting way of thinking about synchronicity is that to the extent that one can become conscious of oneself, one becomes more conscious of the world. And so when one realizes that the tree is growing within oneself, one then sees trees in the world on which they can climb. That's one way to think about it. Okay, so let's leave that there because there's going to be a fair bit more discussion of that next time. The primary image for interpretation in this lecture is that she does go over the tree. The means of the tree coming into being will save, but she goes over the tree. She sees an old man, and I looked into his eyes, she said, and saw within a great river. So the notion here is something like there is impersonal growth. The eye of God allows her to retreat into the natural processes that generate this impersonal growth, which is the tree, over which she climbs and sees something potentially like Father Time, and the river may also represent the river of time. And then Jung goes on to suggest that what we're really seeing here is Christiana coming to a new level of consciousness, and that consciousness is sort of the means of redemption of suffering. So the sacrifice, right, if you think about, there's no really catharsis in the sacrifice of the subjectivity. The snake is vomited, it's dissolved, she sees the eye of God. There's nothing really resolved there. What Jung is suggesting is the outcome of this is a raising of consciousness and a ability to see time from the outside. Something like that. She sees also some men standing along the river, and the notion is that those who are enlightened can see the flow of time as the flow of time. They aren't participating in the flow of time in an entangled way. And we'll get to that. Well, there's a religious interpretation here, but let me read some of Jung's interpretations. He says, consciousness is a sort of redemption from the eternal wheel of death and rebirth. So consciousness can stand outside of time. Of course, death and rebirth here, we'd want to say something about the psychological interpretation, which is the ups and downs of my life. Bringing consciousness to your life allows you to see your life from the outside, as it were, not in a splitting or some kind of pathology, but in the sense of, I have two beings within me. One is operating within the confines of time, and one is eternal. And he says this, which I think is an important quote. He says, the purpose of existence. Okay, this is Carl Jung talking, Protestant, son of a Protestant theologian, renowned psychologist, opining on the purpose of existence. So maybe we'll pay attention to this. The purpose of existence is that one should become conscious. Consciousness redeems one from the curse of that eternal flowing on in the river of unconsciousness. So that's redemption for Jung. This is the redemption of Christ and the redemption of man, is to become conscious. He's suggesting there is a heightened state of awareness wherein the follies of one's life, the traumas and the sins, can all be seen as being redeemed just by having a certain type of consciousness towards it. It is almost as if one were securing a position outside of time through consciousness. That consciousness forms the bridge over death. Initiates should remember their former lives. So this is, I think, an important point. Christiana is at this point being initiated into the mysteries of the unconscious. these mysteries of the unconscious have been codified into rites and sacred sort of rituals for thousands and thousands of years. But the suggestion, Jung's suggestion here, is that these rites encoded unconscious symbolism that were made explicit through an extroversion, and then you just followed along the rite in its own right, and you never had the connection with your consciousness. But what's happening with Christiana is she's spontaneously initiating herself, is sort of the idea here. So she's an initiate who saw the dual aspect God, who saw the ecstatic God, who saw coming into consciousness of the natural growth of consciousness that redeems one, puts one outside of time, puts sin and trauma into context. He says initiates should remember their former lives, thereby establishing a continuity of existence which defends them against the dissolving influences of the unconscious. So there's some continuity here. The tree is some kind of continuing. You're not leaving your old life. You're getting a new perspective on your old life. That's sort of the idea. To be conscious of time is to be out of time. It is to be timeless and therefore immortal. This was Demos talking. So remember, Demos is the philosopher from Harvard, the Greek philosopher from Harvard, with more explicitly a Neoplatonic and Christian sort of beliefs. And he's saying that, yes, this too, this is what it means to become immortal. When Christians say that they will receive their immortal bodies, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about a consciousness that transcends the physical. You can never become conscious of it if you don't accept it. So this is sort of the life lesson here. This ties it all the way back to the dual aspect God. You can never become conscious of it if you don't accept it. If you don't accept your whole life in all of its chaotic entanglements, you don't live it. So how can you become conscious of it? You cannot detach from the entanglements of life if you are not in it. Only through an intimate knowledge of it can you detach from it. This is his whole theory of alchemy, the whole theory of psychotherapy, the whole theory of the analytic third, is that you will become entangled in your life, and only through certain acts like analysis can you disentangle and get higher consciousness. And that's sort of a mystery. I think we'll ultimately have to get to that next time in the next lecture series about what exactly it means. How do you disentangle from the entanglement of your life? But that's sort of the end notion here, is that Christiana has achieved this new level of consciousness. Okay, so quick comment then on the relationship between what Jung is doing with this more empirical approach to the initiation rites and that which has been codified in the Christian doctrines. I think the comparison here is with the paradox of the Christ, who both suffered and is impassible, who was tempted but could not sin. I think the notion is an awareness of suffering and temptation that contextualizes temptation or suffering. Christ had this dual approach. He was at once had a foot in the world and a foot out of the world. He was at once human and God. The notion, of course, with Christiana is that this state of awareness, of detachment, can be attained by the human person, whether it's through Christianity, whether it's through other forms of contemplation. The idea that Christ was God is the idea that he was at once participating in, but also detached from the temporal world in a sort of stance from eternity. Okay, so that was the winter 1931 term of Jung's vision seminars. We will pick it up with the next term next time.